Hello and welcome to Eye on Africa here on France 24. I'm Clarisse Fortuné and these are the headlines. They were expected in Rwanda. They met in Qatar. In a surprising twist of event, DR Congo and Rwanda presidents hold an informal meeting. Felix Tshisekedi and Paul Kagame expressed their support for a ceasefire in a joint statement. Diplomatic tension between France and Algeria. The two countries' relationships are under increasing strain after Algeria opposed a French bid to deport several dozen Algerians, rejecting France's threats and ultimatums. And then we'll go to the land of Cesaria Evora. Famed Moma singer lived in Mindelo, a small port city on the island of São Vicente in Cape Verde. Her music still resonates in the streets 14 years after her death. So in a surprise announcement, the presidents of Rwanda, Paul Kagame, and DR Congo, Felix Tshisekedi, are said to have met in Qatar this Tuesday. The Qatari Ministry of Foreign Affairs released a joint statement that says the heads of state reaffirmed the commitment of all parties to an immediate and unconditional ceasefire as agreed. And that agreement refers to the African summit that took place last month in Tanzania. So let's try to make sense of the situation by bringing Thierry Vircoulon, an analyst. Thank you very much, Thierry Vircoulon, for joining us. First, so what is your reaction? What do you make of this meeting? Are you surprised?
Well, that is indeed a surprise for various reasons. The first reason is that now for quite a long time, both presidents of Congo and Rwanda refused to meet face to face. When they last met, they exchange strong words. People say that they insulted each other. So for quite a long time, they have refused to meet, and that changed suddenly. And the second surprise comes from the fact that, in fact, Qatar has already tried to organize such a meeting in early 2023, and at the last minute, President Tshisekedi did not show up. So that's why it's quite surprising. And of course, as you mentioned, there was supposed to be a meeting not in Qatar, but in Angola between the Congolese government and the M23, and this meeting did not happen. And instead, we had that meeting between the president of Congo and the president of Rwanda, not in Angola, but in Qatar. So that's why the surprise.
And of course, you just mentioned the key players were expected in Rwanda and Angola. So instead, Tshisekedi and Kagame met in Dakar. But without the M23, where were they?
Well, the M23 refused actually to go to Angola. They talked about security guarantees, and they also asked for the lifting of the European sanctions that were announced on Monday. And as some of their leaders have been sanctioned by the European Union, they say that they will not go to talks in Rwanda as long as those sanctions won't be lifted. But what is also quite interesting is that finally President Tshisekedi obtained some sort of an advantage, I would say, because from the beginning of that conflict, he always said that that M23 issue has to be sorted out with Rwanda, because that rebellion is backed by the Rwandan army. And of course, President Kagame denied this repeatedly. But we see that at the end of the day, it's not a meeting between the Congolese government and the M23 that happened, but a meeting between the two head of states of Rwanda and Congo. So it's a kind of, I would say, a small advantage for President Tshisekedi.
So on Monday, the EU imposed sanctions against few Rwandan military. Do you think that pressure contributes to Paul Kagame to accept that meeting?
Yes, definitely. I think the president of Rwanda did not bet on sanctions at the beginning of this year when the M23 took over Goma and Bukavu. He bet that there will not be a unified front from the Europeans, and that the new US president will actually be on his side. So far, he made a mistake, I would say a strategic mistake. The European Union, as you said, has sanctioned Rwandan militaries, and it seemed that the line in Washington about this conflict remained the same, basically from the Biden administration to this administration. So there's no change of position by Washington so far.
So as I was saying, the joint statement said that the meeting was informal, so nothing concrete came out of that meeting. So, but is there still hope for future negotiations and possibly for a resolution of the conflict?
Well, I think what was discussed in that meeting was the ceasefire in the Kivus. And I think there was an agreement, probably an agreement between the two presidents about a ceasefire on the ground. This will, of course, will have to be confirmed with the M23. And we'll see, of course, this week if indeed the fighting stopped there. But I think what was, of course, the first step is that idea of a ceasefire that is agreed both by Kigali and Kinshasa. So that's, I would say, also a small first step, but a necessary step.
Thierry Vircoulon, thank you very much. Thierry Vircoulon, Associate Researcher at AFRI Africa Center. Thank you very much for your analysis. We'll continue monitoring the situation there.
Thanks for having me.
Now, another diplomatic tension. Algeria refuses to accept France's bid to deport dozens of Algerian nationals, saying Paris needs to go through the appropriate channels in the latest episode of a strained relationship between the two countries. French Interior Minister Bruno Retailleau says his government will issue a calibrated response. Matthew Marie-Carouchet.
The rift between Algeria and France deepened on Monday as Algiers once again refused to accept the return of its citizens. France had recently sent a list of about 60 Algerian nationals that it wanted to deport, with the hard-line French Interior Minister labeling them as dangerous or former convicts. But Algeria would not be cowed, as it said it wanted to ensure the rights of individuals subject to deportation measures.
Algeria reaffirms that it categorically rejects threats and intimidation attempts, as well as injunctions, ultimatums and denunciations. The French have been invited to follow the usual channel which has been established between prefectures and consulates.
Since his appointment to Interior Minister in September, Bruno Retailleau has championed a tough policy regarding immigration, threatening to resign if France allows Algeria to continue to reject deportations. On Sunday, he promised to raise the stakes.
I regret that Algeria refuses to apply international law. As decided by the Interministerial Committee chaired by the Prime Minister, a progressive response will be implemented.
The Algerian deportation issue has become heated in France, especially after a fatal knife attack in February by an Algerian national. French authorities had tried to expel him multiple times in the past. Algerians have had special immigration status in France since the 1960s, when Algeria ceased being a French colony and the two countries agreed to exempt Algerian nationals from common immigration law. But recently, the French government has threatened to withdraw from the agreement. Paris and Algiers have had tense relations for years, but ties have deteriorated significantly since July 2024, when French President Emmanuel Macron recognized Moroccan sovereignty over the disputed Western Sahara, also claimed by the Algerian-backed Polisario Front. Since being re-elected in September, Algerian President Abdelmajid Tebboune has yet to set foot in France, having repeatedly postponed a state visit that was first planned years ago.
And for background, Algeria proclaimed independence from France more than 60 years ago. In 1968, the two countries signed a migratory agreement under which Algerian nationals would have special rights in France. This agreement is now under threat. Algerians made up 16% of foreign-born people in France last year, making them the #1 foreign population. Antonia Carrigan takes us through the content of this deal.
On the 27th of December 1968, Algerian Foreign Minister Abdelaziz Bouteflika and French diplomat Jean Badevant signed a historic agreement. Paris would allow entry to a revisable quota of 35,000 Algerian workers per year and grant them a special status. They could enter the country freely and then had 9 months to find work, unlike other nationalities who only had 3. Once in employment, they were entitled to a 5-year residency permit. Signed 6 years after Algerian independence, France was in need of workers, but wanted to reserve the right to adjust its quotas and reduce the duration of residency permits in case of mass unemployment. The agreement has undergone 3 major revisions, and since 1986, Algerians are no longer exempt from visa requirements. But it remains the document of reference governing migration between the two countries, one that the French far right rejects as obsolete, demanding the deal be renegotiated or abandoned, a demand Algiers slams as racist and Islamophobic.
Mindelo is a small port city on the island of São Vicente in Cape Verde. It was once home to Cesaria Evora. She was celebrated around the world for her morna style, a nostalgic musical genre, now recognized as a piece of cultural heritage by UNESCO. Her music still resonates in the streets on her island, where the barefoot diva lived until her death nearly 14 years ago.
An unforgettable melody, one that often soundtracks Cape Verdean nights and is etched into the hearts of its musicians. Saudade, the global hit by Cesaria Evora, put the West African archipelago on the map. Known as the Barefoot Diva, she often performed without shoes in her native Creole. 14 years after Cesaria's death, her legacy lives on.
To us, she is the Barefoot Diva, with her warmth, her voice, her kindness. She is a great inspiration. To this day, her songs are still played everywhere, on the radio, at home.
Famous for singing morna, a genre of music from Cape Verde, her songs often explored love, nostalgia, and the history of Cape Verdean people. In the city that she lived her whole life, Cesaria is omnipresent, from banknotes to the local cafes, where friends and acquaintances still share tales from the musician's extraordinary life.
When she invited the mayor for lunch, he came and sat down. Then a local madman happened to walk past her house. She called out to him, "Hey, come here," and asked if he'd eaten. She told him to sit down and eat with the mayor. She placed the madman right next to the mayor. That was Cesaria. For her, everyone was equal.
She was always the same person. She never changed. She helped others.
Mindelo is soon opening a new museum dedicated to their beloved diva.
Cesaria Evora's heritage to conclude our edition of Eye on Africa. Thank you for watching. More news coming up on France 24.